Well, it's Dado Day on the Mobile Sanding Center project, but before we get started, just a quick reminder that dados, grooves, and rabbets are all essentially the same thing. We, for clarity purposes, usually refer to a cut that's made on the edge of a board that only has two sides as a rabbet. And when the cut is made with the grain, it's called a groove. And when the cut is made across the grain, like in this old test board of mine, it's called a dado. We're going to cut all of the dados on this project with a router. And we're going to try to make the cuts as simple as possible and do as many of them at the same time as we can. If you take a look at the plans and look at the top view of the cabinet, you'll see that the center divider in this cabinet is let into a dado in the back of the cabinet. Then if you look at the front view of the plans, you'll see that that same divider is let into a dado in the top of the cabinet and also at the bottom. And all three of those pieces extend all the way to the left-hand side of the cabinet, and the dimension is 17.5 inches over to the edge of that vertical piece. So if we line up the left edges of the top, the back, and the bottom together and fix our dado location, we should be able to route all three at the same time and they'll be perfectly lined up. These are the three pieces again, the bottom, the back, and the top, and they need a dado cut lined up perfectly and referenced off this left-hand edge of the cabinet. So the first step to do is to get them butted together nice and tight, and then get these edges lined up, and then you can just use some simple clamps to clamp those edges down and make sure that they stay nice and tight. And we'll do some more clamping on this before we start cutting. But we'll get this fastened down first. We got those in registration, and I'll get some clamps over on the other edge. So now the next thing to do is to locate where the dados are going to be, where the dado is going to be. So I measured over 17.5 inches, which is the location of the vertical divider in the cabinet. From that 17.5 inch point, I went over another 3/8 of an inch and marked the center point of the dado for this 3/4 inch plywood. I marked it on this board, I marked it again on this board, and I marked it again on this board down here at this end. So now we can set up the guide rail and the router to make our first cut. Okay, setting up the Festool for making dado cuts is really pretty easy. The first thing that I did was I installed a 3/4 inch undersized router bit that's sized for plywood. This does a pretty good job, so I got that installed. And then I put in the guide rail attachment. There's these two rods and this guide rail attachment, which is sold separately. And I position it so that the router is all the way off of the guide rail. Now you can do this a couple of different ways. You can do it where the router is partially on the guide rail. And the guide rail attachment includes this little footy thing over here that you loosen, drop this down, and it holds the other side of the router up off of the workpiece so that it's level with the guide rail. What I found that works much better is this auxiliary base that Festool calls a small bore base. I think this was originally created for using a router bit with a bearing and going around like the top of a table and routing a decorative edge, and the small hole here helps keep the router from tipping when you get to the corner of a tabletop. But this small bore base has another advantage, which is perfect for my uses here, and that's that the thickness of that base is identical to the thickness of the guide rail. So I can position this here with the router completely off of the guide rail, and it'll be level and straight going across. So the next step, after all that's done, is to set the depth. And that's really easy to do. Just push the plunge down until the bit makes contact with the workpiece. Tighten this up. And then Kreg makes this little set of measuring implements. Comes in a bunch of different sizes in a attractive little plastic box. This happens to be the 1/4 inch. You can use this on a router table. This is a 1/4 inch inset here to set a router bit height. This is a 1/4 inch above this, and it has this little 1/4 inch ear out here. If you take that little ear and just set it in here where the guidepost is, drop that down and tighten this up. Then when you plunge your router, the depth of the dado will be exactly a 1/4 inch. Real easy. So that's the setup. All we have to do now, I'm going to attach the dust collection, and all we have to really do now is to line up our cut. Lining up the cut on a Festool router is quite easy. If you recall, I made a center mark where the dado is going to be, and there's a line here on the base, both front and back on the router. And if you line up that line with your mark, that will be the center of your dado. So I've lined up both ends, I've clamped the guide rail down, and we're ready to cut. Okay, so in my setup here, I have a spacer board at this end and a small spacer board at the other end, just so that the guide rail is not hanging off into open space. But it serves another purpose too, and that's to reduce any tear out at the beginning and end of the cut. And also this large board here is going to give me an opportunity to make a test cut. So we'll make that test cut first and just confirm that the depth and everything is correct. And again, this little Kreg setup bar is really nice. This 1/4 inch raised piece here, we can just put down here and see that this is just about perfect. So that looks good for the 1/4 inch depth. And then we'll take a small scrap of our plywood and see how it fits. Yeah, that looks like that's going to be a nice tight fit. Yep, that's just perfect. So we're ready to cut. Okay, our first dado is cut, 3 boards, and it looks very nice. So we're in pretty good shape. Okay, parts D and E, D the divider and E the end piece, they're the same size. So that means that the end piece needs to be set into rabbets, just like the divider piece was set into dados in the middle of the cabinet. So the next step is to cut a rabbet on all 3 of these boards on the right hand end. While they're in position and clamped into place is the best time to go ahead and do this. Now before I remove these clamps over here on this side, the first thing that I want to do is I want to take this little spacer piece and line it up exactly with the end down here of this piece of plywood and clamp it into registration. And the reason that I want to do that is because I want to be able to test, use this as a test as well when I get the router set up. Now, this is not level because this piece of plywood is warped just a little bit, but the guide rail will pull that down and it'll be flat after it's pulled down in place. So I'm just going to clamp this in a couple of places. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with the spacer at the other end. This will also make sure that we're holding these boards in position. Okay, so I've got the guide rail clamped in place. I think it's in the right spot. And I've got a little spacer piece down here. So I'm going to make a test cut and see how that looks just in that little couple of inches and see if we're ready to make our cut. Okay, a very slight adjustment to the right seems to have got it. I've tested at this end, tested at that end, and the rabbet looks to be about the right size. So let's make our cut. Okay, probably noticed the dust collection didn't work too good there, and that's because one whole side of the base plate is off of the wood, so the dust extraction can't really collect all the chips. But that's an easy thing to take care of. We'll just turn it back on. Okay, now that's a pretty nice looking rabbet. Let's see how it fits. It's a piece of our scrap, and that is just about perfect. Okay, so we're good there. So this is as good a time as any to kind of mock this thing up and see where we're at. And so what I've done is I've taken the base where we've routed the two dados across it, and I put that on top of the other base. Not really necessary, but I just did it. And then I put the divider piece into its dado, and I put the end piece into its dado, and I set this back piece on top. And what you'll see here is the back piece is raised up. That's because we still need to cut a rabbet along this back edge of the base piece. So I'm just going to take a piece of chalk and mark a line in here just to remind myself that that's where that rabbet needs to go. Now the other thing that we can see by mocking this up is by taking this panel, which is going to be the front here, and if I just set this on top of the base, I see two things that need to be done. First of all, a rabbet needs to be cut along here, just up to this dado. And then a rabbet needs to be cut in this side panel to accommodate this piece because it's sticking out a 1/4 inch over here. So once we route a 1/4 inch deep rabbet on this panel, this will line up flush with this front edge. And remember that whatever we route on this base, we've got to route on the top as well. So taking the top and orienting it with the dados, which are not going to sink in yet, we can see that we need to make a full length rabbet along this back panel. and a rabbet just up to this dado in this panel. So to make sure I don't mess up my orientation, I'm going to take this off and make sure I mark this all the way across. So we got a rabbet here and then a rabbet just on this section right here. Okay? So we got a few more rabbets to cut. Let's get at it. Okay, for the rest of the rabbets, I'm going to set up my router table to cut those. I have a different 3/4 inch plywood bit. You could actually use a regular 3/4 inch bit, since you're going to use the fence to adjust the depth of the cut to get the width of the rabbet just right. And I use the same Kreg guide to set the depth. I got that set. And then I'm going to show you an easy way to set the distance, at least initially. You may still have to make an adjustment. But if you take 3 scraps of the same plywood you're using for your project, put one on either side of the blade, and then you can take your third piece and just push it up and adjust the fence until the blade just comes in contact with the piece of wood. Then in theory your cut should be exactly the same depth as the piece of plywood. Now we'll make a test cut just to make sure, and to make sure that we have the height of the bit correct. And there we go. That's perfect. Okay, now this piece I'm only going to cut up to that dado, so when I hear the change in tone on that bit, I'll know where I am. I'm also going to make a little chalk mark here, just so where I know where it is, so I know when I'm getting close. Okay, there's my change in tone, so I know I've hit where the dado was. Do is just do the same thing to the top that we did to the bottom. Now this is the top piece, and the rabbet is going to go on this end down here. So I'm going to position the board with the bit in the existing rabbet. We'll cut the full-length rabbet in the other side. And I believe that completes all the cuts. So let's go take a look. Okay, so once again, I set the base on top of its other base, and got that lined up. I put in the divider piece, got the back, and notice now it's flush. So we'll look at the front piece. The Front piece is now going to sit in this rabbet, and that's flush and square, so that's ready to go. And the end piece will go right here, and that also is flush and square. Okay, so the last thing that I did was I chalked in marks, orientation marks, to remind me of the way I've got everything facing, because it can get a little hectic during a glue up sometimes. So got that set, and like I said, I'm going to do a little bit of sanding, and then we'll glue this bad boy up. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.